Okay, so it is my great pleasure to have Professor Martha Bailey here to give us the seventh crafts lecture. So this is a lecture where the idea came from Sasha Better here. And in 2019, we had the first crafts lecture given by James Robinson. And then we have had a series of fantastic scholars giving it, and it's a pleasure to have you here, Martha. I don't want to introduce Martha because you know her work and you know she straddles across economic history, demography, labor economics. Started out in Michigan, now in UCLA. I just want to emphasize three, maybe four strands of her research, if I may. And so labor force participation of women is one of the themes Martha has worked on. In particular, the papers I know, and I always put it in the reading list, are those of the effect of the birth control pill and women's fertility and labor market participation. She's also looked at gender pay gap emerging from it. Second strand is demography related, health related, uh, long-term development stuff. She's done several papers on that. She's built this longitudinal data set of four generations, linking people and families. And finally, the welfare reforms of Lyndon Johnson, right? And there's a whole series of work related to that. So it's a very impressive CV. So thank you for being here and giving the crafts lecture of 2026.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and thanks so much for having me. Thank you for the very gracious introduction. I think there are different ways you can plan to give a kind of a keynote or a big lecture like this. And in coordination with the organizers, we decided that some of my work that is newest, not sort of the oldest overview of a body. This is a brand new set of things that we're working on and largely coming out of the Life M project that we've decided to present. So I should say, in some sense, when people give a keynote or a big lecture, they're not looking for feedback. It's kind of like a bookend of work that's complete. This is not that. So I'm very much welcoming your feedback. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say and also your suggestions, because this is just the beginning, I think, of a broader kind of research project. I also need to acknowledge two wonderful co-authors, Sharik Mohammed, who's at Northeastern University, and Paul Monin, who's at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And I also need to tell you, because we will be using, you can't see this, but it tells you that the views are ours and not those of the Federal Reserve Bank or the Federal Reserve System, and also not those of the Census Bureau, because we are going to be disclosing, we will be showing you disclosed restricted census data as part of this project. So the 20th century is well known to be the human capital century, and that is extremely clear in the context of the United States. So just looking at a figure here of the mean number of years of schooling sort of by age 30 for US-born individuals. This is taken from a paper by Otter, Golden, and Katz. And you can see that the mean number of years really increases across the 20th century. The US starts the 20th century as one of the most widely educated countries in the world. The high school movement builds upon this lead, increasing the share of students who are graduating from high school from 10% in 1910 to over 50% by 1940. After World War II, we see surges in college enrollment, with undergraduate enrollments doubling again by 1970, and then again by 2019. So this is an extraordinary century of human capital investments and also rising educational attainment in the United States. At the same time, we see an extraordinary rise in spending, public spending on education. One of the things I'm not showing you here, but I'll just tell you, is that the spending on primary and secondary schooling rises over 20 times in real terms between 1920 and 2020 in the United States. That's a huge number. What I'm plotting here are the primary and secondary school teachers per 100 children, ages 5 to 19. You can also see instructors at colleges per 100 children, and then instructors at public colleges. So you can see that all of these are trending up. And so one of the big questions that we had when we entered into this project, so I should say Golden and Katz wrote a terrific book about these things. We're going to ask a closely related but not identical question to one of the things that they're looking at. that we're interested in how educational opportunity changes over the 20th century, not how educational attainment changes over the 20th century, how educational opportunity changes over the 20th century. And in particular, we're interested in whether or not the expansion of public resources that I just showed you decrease the persistence of advantage or potential, you might think reduce the influence of parents' own education on that of children, and said another way, raise the importance of merit, hard work, and so on. So I'll define educational opportunity in just a moment, but we'll come back to that. But just let me start by saying, who cares about educational opportunity? Don't we know everything we need to know by just thinking about occupational or income-based mobility or opportunity? And I want to argue that the answer to that is no, and I think education is a really important part of the story. There's a few reasons for that. First, complementarity. So we think that there's a lot of variation in income mobility that is strongly determined by pre-market factors. We really want to understand those pre-market factors to understand sort of the values of different types of investments. But there's also a really important conceptual difference here. Educational opportunity captures earnings potential. Your human capital is about your earnings potential. I imagine that many people in this room could be earning much higher salaries if you went into finance. And instead, many of you have chosen to work in universities and train the next generation, right? So the idea is that your income might not truly capture your earnings potential, but we think earnings potential is important. But another reason this is particularly important is that occupational mobility and income mobility are only defined for people who have occupations and income, which means historically that you're going to leave out women. Why? Because very few of them are working for pay outside the household. And it also means many of them won't have actually formally defined occupations that you could kind of measure. Or if they do, if it's something like housewife, how does one quantify that? For example, is one running a large house? Is one running a small house? What exactly does that mean? So the measurement of education is also available for everyone, regardless of whether or not they have an occupation or an income, which I think is also important. And finally, the reason of policy. So we think that education in the United States is directly tied to local public policy, right? Local fiscal decisions, tax decisions, all of those types of things in a way that means that we're going to be able to leverage some of that local variation to say something more importantly about the role of these local public policies in terms of determining if you care about occupational or income mobility over the 20th century. A final reason is that we actually know much less about it. And I'm going to get into some of the measurement. I've just told you some great things about education. We'll get into some of the things about the difficulty of measuring education as well. So let me just tell you, though, what we do know about education in the United States and educational. I'm going to switch here from saying educational opportunity or mobility to educational persistence, and I'll show you this in just a moment. But this is typically measured by looking at a child's outcome, educational outcome, by regressing that on their parents' educational outcome. You're either going to look at sort of elasticities, you might think about a regression coefficient or a correlation coefficient. So here I'm plotting intergenerational educational persistence as measured by a correlation coefficient. It helps us compare a bit more over time and showing you the types of studies that are available. So we have one survey-based estimate by Hertz et al., and this is kind of increasing over time. We also have another measure of persistence. This is by Fletcher et al. Using different survey data, showing sort of this decline. We have this really fantastic paper by Joe Ferry, Catherine Massey, and Jonathan Rosenbaum. You're looking at these 2 data points. They come up with a linked data set, and they're comparing 2 different cohorts. They find actually a lot of stability. They're really going after sort of the effects of grandparents in that paper, but from that paper, you can see what the intergenerational educational correlation coefficients are too. And then we have a number of sort of one-off points over the 20th century where we're just looking at these intergenerational relationships. So a couple of things that we're going to do. First, we're going to extend knowledge back to much earlier in the 20th century. These are for cohorts that are born between 1910 and roughly 1919. And we're going to extend that forward to the most recent cohorts that are finishing their education. So you can think about this as we're going to kind of stretch that out. The other thing I'm not going to show you too much on is I've worked a lot with data linking. And there's 2 types of errors one can make with data linking. One, you link to the wrong person. which if you're studying mobility is really problematic, because linking Martha to not Martha means that my education is right likely to be very different than what we would have gotten if when linked to me. So that's one type of error, and the other type of error are the type 2 errors. That is the people that you don't link, and thinking about the sample selection bias introduced by that. So one of the things we do is we know from nationally representative surveys, we went back and we put together surveys. This is using the General Social Survey and another national survey of households to put together survey evidence over the 20th century just to benchmark. You can't see our data point. It's right here. And then the survey estimate is right over the top of it for the early 20th century. So I'm going to try to reassure you that both we don't think linking error is going to influence these results, and we also don't think the sample selection issue will influence our results, though we can't say that when we start getting down to much smaller geographic areas, but we can kind of benchmark it nationally. And this is our most recent data point. These are the recent cohorts from the census, and their linked data. We are not doing that linking. That's linked by the Census Bureau, and you can see there's a minor difference there. We're not sure if that's about sort of responses to surveys that differ from the linking or census linking. We don't know for sure, but just to put your mind at ease, I think we're pretty close. The second thing we're going to do with these very, very big samples, I was telling you all of this is based on survey evidence, right? So these are smaller surveys looking across cohorts. So you're getting maybe 50, maybe a couple of hundred people per cohort if you're looking over time, but we have very, very large samples. And that means that we're going to be able to look at these things for a lot more subgroups and across the United States. So we're going to come up with much more precise estimates at sort of at the county level. So we can tell you about that. We're going to add measures of upward mobility, which one can do with really large samples like this. And the final thing is that we're going to link, I'll just let you just go into the maps, link intergenerational educational mobility to changes in educational spending at the local level. So that's where we're headed today. A couple of contributions of this work. We provide new evidence on relative and upward intergenerational mobility across the 20th century. One of the things I'm going to be showing you is that we know that there's this sort of linearity in the rank-rank relationship for income-based mobility today. That also holds for educational mobility, which is also going to be very, very useful because it's a very lumpy thing and you get people in these bins. So I'll show you why that matters. And we'll be able to look more directly at sort of comparisons for the same percentiles across time. Another thing we'll be doing is we'll be looking at the role of these public investments in education. We'll be both documenting changes at the county level and this convergence in educational mobility across place in the United States, but we'll also be looking at the role, we're going to try to quantify causally the role of funding for both primary and secondary education and also tertiary education to the best we can. This is, of course, a very hard thing to do, but we'll be using a state border design, and I'll show you some more on that. And then finally, we're going to be providing, and this is the direction we're moving now, is new evidence on the determinants of changes in income mobility over the 20th century, and in particular, the role of sort of these pre-market factors that we're capturing in education. Okay, so with that, this is a short talk, so I'm not going to give you a whole roadmap of where we're going. I'll kind of roll it out as we go. Let me first start talking a little bit about the LifeM project. Thank you for mentioning this. This is something, I think Casper was asking me, how long have you been working on this project? Like over a decade for sure. I'm not exactly sure, but we've been working on the LifeM project. And one of the things we do as part of the LifeM project is we're linking together birth records, death records, and census records over multiple generations. And one of the nice things about the birth records is that they contain mother's birth name, or other people call it maiden name, so that you can follow her both to her birth family as well as to her married family, so you can say a lot more about women. And this turns out to be really important because on the census form, you're just going to get a woman's legal name very often, which means you can't follow her. If you observe her married, you can't follow her back to her birth family. And if you observe her in her birth family, you can't follow her forward to her married family without other records. The other thing we do in the LifeM project is we generated, I think it was kind of overkill. I thought we would need a lot of data. We didn't. We can talk more about that if you're interested. But we generated over 50,000 hand-linked records that were hand-linked by either 2 or up to 5 individual trainers. We had a whole system that we set up like a little app, and we collected all the information in the metadata, and we used this information to train machine learning models to predict how well-trained trainers make decisions. We also used it, by the way, to figure out which of our trainers were watching Netflix, which you can identify with like, you know, all of these sort of systematic errors and other types of things. So we think we actually have a very good, cleaned data set, and it's kind of an iterative process to detect errors. So we're going to be using all of that infrastructure here to link a different set of records. We're going to start with the SS5. So these are records from the Social Security Administration. And every time you change your name for the Social Security Administration, they capture this on a file. It has your name, sex, race, year and place of birth, and your name changes. So if you start, we will have both the birth name of women and also their married name. This is extremely helpful, and both of their parents' full names. So this is one of the difficulties in linking in historical data is it's a very low information environment, right? So the SS5 records have a whole lot of data. We then link these individuals to the 1940 census. We link men using their birth name, and we link women both using their birth name and their married name. You can do both because you have both observations on SS5. We also link these individuals to their siblings because you have information on both parents. Again, think of 2 full names. This is a lot of information. So you can link them to all the siblings they have. You can link them as families to the 1920 and a variety of other censuses to pick up other types of characteristics, which also allows us to do a much better job linking parents to the 1940 census that you get here. So all in all, we have a sample of about 1.5 million children born in the United States between 1910 and 1920, roughly, with an 18% match rate, about 50% of whom are women. Now, fast forwarding to our modern day cohort, this is using the restricted census data and the Federal Statistical Research Data Center. This linking is done by the census, not by us, but they have this information called a PIC. So we have on the census long form, this has children who are living with their parents observed in the same household in 2000. That's what the census collects. You also get parents' years of education on the long form, and you know the county of residence where they're living in the restricted data. You have a short form. Remember, we collect this for the entire US population, and that short form also includes parents living with their children. This is nice, but it doesn't have any information on outcomes like parents' education. But it does have county of residence in the short form. So we do a couple of things there. So one is we're linking these children to the SS5 records. These are modern restricted. It's also called a Numinant file, where you get a lot of other information, especially things like place of birth. And we also can link these using these personal identification keys or PICs to the 2001 to 2022 American Community Surveys, where we get information on children's educational outcomes and also the parents' educational outcomes for the parents who didn't have it, weren't on the long form. So altogether, the American Community Surveys are repeated samples. They're not supposed to sample the same household for at least 3 years. We come up with about 2.1 million children linked this way with parents who have educational information, about 49% of whom are women. So just to compare these final two data sets, we have the 1940 census outcomes. These are cohorts that are born 1910 to 1920, and then we have modern day cohorts born roughly between 1982 and 1987. We have them linked to their parents directly in the modern period and also through the SS5 form here. We have educational outcomes for both parents and children, and we also have place of residence in childhood, which is going to be important because we want to know which local school policies they would have been subject to. Okay, so what do we mean by educational mobility? Over at the 20th century, one of the things I just showed you is that the mean attainment, years of schooling, is increasing, right? So you have the parents' distribution. This is very stylized, it's not normal. But I just use this, the parents' generation, and you have the child's generation. And over time, the entire distribution is shifting up. So if that just means it's a rank preserving shift, if children from the lowest SES or the least educated parents go on in their own generation, even though they're getting more education, but they remain sort of at the same rank, we would say this would be and it's the same thing at the top. They have the same rank as their parents. The idea is that this is a very deterministic society. That is, where you're born, who you're born to, this birth lottery is going to determine in large part where you end up. an educationally mobile society, even though it could look the same in terms of the mean attainment, would show a lot more shifting around. Why? So you've got some kids who are born to parents who are less educated, but perhaps with access to better education are able to move much well up in the distribution relative to their parents. You've got other kids who are born to much more educated parents for a variety of reasons. They're not going to end up there, and so on. So the idea is that parents, we know that for a variety of reasons, if genetics matter, or if you think that the parents are passing forward directly some of the education to their parents, those correlations are going to be zero. The intergenerational correlations, but the stronger that correlation is between parents and children, the less educationally mobile, the less educational opportunity we think there will be. So economists typically operationalize this, give me just a second, using a measure of relative mobility, which would rank something like a child's rank. You've seen this in the income mobility literature on a parent's rank, and they would look at this beta here. And that would be sort of a measure of that persistence. You could also think of absolute upward mobility, which Raj Chetty is doing sort of for the income distribution, and they choose the 25th percentile. That is, they're going to look at the expected rank of a child whose parent is at the 25th percentile. So that's kind of a measure of lower class, sort of. So they're thinking about, for kids that are lower class, how likely are they to move up above where their parents are? Did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, super interesting work. I was wondering if you could go back to the figure. On top of issues of equity, I think that understanding whether or not there is this redistribution across ranks depends on what is the function that translates from stock of human capital to wages. Because if it's just the level of education
Right.
at some point that matters, we don't really care that beyond the equity considerations.
I don't know. I don't think that's right. I mean, if you have the annexed Einstein who grows up in poverty, even if they're much more educated, but they're not right. So that's kind of the idea, is that so if you want that child who's extremely talented to be kind of at the frontier, they also need to have that education. You're not going to get that with just a high school, even if high school is well above what their parents would have had. So that's kind of the idea. So you want to think about the shifting up over time. You want to think about this in a rank sense.
If the education keeps shifting, that person at the low level maybe will reach at some point university, because there's a cap also in how much
Right.
education you can get.
Right.
And so
We're not there yet, but yes, in theory, yes, we keep going. We're going to have to talk about we'll talk about postdocs and then apprenticeship, like the way that, it just kind of keeps going, all the training. Right, that's right. So this is what we're thinking about over the 20th century. So let me move on here. Now, okay, yes.
Ask why you're not looking at downward mobility.
It's also, we can look at downward mobility, and I'll show you this in just a minute. We're just going to focus on the persistence. So when you get that line out of the data, you can look at any point you want. You can look at downward mobility the same, and you're also going to think, because this is going to be normed to hit the 50th percentile, changes in upward mobility will be accompanied by increases in downward mobility, as long as it's linear, which I will show you it will be. So we can report that as well.
Can we keep the questions just to clarifications and then take them at the end?
Okay.
Is that okay?
Okay.
Or unless you want to be interrupted, that's fine.
No, well, if you interrupt me more, we'll get to fewer results. And if you interrupt me less, maybe we'll, but I'll try to be fast. So the measurement issues, though, with education are very different. If you've looked at Chetty et al.'s income-based measures, it's almost continuous in terms of income, but education is lumpy. It is in big groups. You have a lot of ties here. So this is 7 years of education. This is a middle school education, which would have been the modal number for cohorts or of parents of children born in this cohort. And then you would have also seen, so for children, the modal outcome is 12. Like I told you, it's high school after this time. So how are you going to deal with these ties? Oh, and then the other issue is, which parent's education will you use? Will you use mother's education, father's education, the minimum, the max, the average? And I'm going to tell you we are going to use the maximum education, and it's not going to matter. We've done a lot of sensitivity checks, so that one's not important. This other one is much more important. It's like how you treat these bins and what you do. So I'm going to really focus here on that. So a couple of choices people would make. Oh, and you can also look in the late 20th century. The other problem is, let's say you decide 25th percentile. We're like, okay, we get that's roughly here. but then we move kind of down over here and oh shoot, what is the 25th percentile over here? It's right in the middle of a bin. How are you going to deal with that at all? What, you know, that becomes like an important measurement issue. So there's a couple of ways people would deal with it. One is you take the midpoint of a bin. So I'm just going to assume that anyone falling in this range here in the 8th grade is going to be roughly the 53rd percentile. Another thing you could do is you could take the lower bound of a bin and the lower bound of a child's bin and look at those transitions. You could look at the upper bound, or lower bound to upper bound to lower bound. So there's all sorts of different ways you could try to benchmark this. So which rank do you mean when you're looking at a bin where there's a whole lot of ties? So let me start by showing you what these look like. So first of all, I told you I would show you that this is roughly linear in percentile ranks. Works pretty well. This is just using the midpoint, the 1910 and the later cohorts. But what if we use lower bound or upper bound? They give you slightly different estimates. Conveniently, the slope is not changing. This is really important. But you could also use upper bound to lower bound to upper bound, and there you can see there's a little bit more sensitivity to slope, especially when you're using some of those. But a couple of things are really important here. Is the expectation of child years of schooling, given parent years of schooling, is roughly linear in percentile ranks. This is going to be really helpful because then we can start to say, you want to look at upward mobility, downward mobility, you want to look at 40th, 50th, whatever percentile, you can start to say a little bit more about that. And the other thing that's really important is that estimates of relative mobility are not very sensitive to these assumptions, though I will say with these some extreme assumptions a little bit more sensitive. We'd say reasonable assumptions. The other thing here is that if you look at the expected rank at the 25th percentile, you can easily see from shifts in the level that this one is going to be sensitive to the definition, right? Because if I use this definition, that's going to give me a very, very different expected rank than this definition, right? Those are big differences in levels, meaningfully different. But one of the important things here is because we're looking at changes over time, it turns out that changes will not be sensitive to these upward mobility definitions. So that's also going to be important. So whatever shift upward it's going to do for the earlier 20th century or shift downward, it's going to be similar enough that it's going to give us basically shifts in the same direction. So that's also that didn't have to turn out that way, but it did turn out that way empirically, which is going to be helpful for trying to draw some conclusions. So just to give you a sense, our preferred specification is this midpoint definition. We are going to be using the rank slope, and then we have these expected ranks at the 25th percentile. I'm going to calculate that here. Even though I don't have something exactly there, I'm going to use that line to approximate where I think it is. So that's how we're going to get that. And you can get that in both periods, even though you're not getting an exact 25th percentile in both periods. So let me just show you what this looks like. If you look at these these regressions, these are our linked data. These are the big data that we have. The survey data, which are the best we can do, we can use them at the national level. Is this font okay? No. Andrew told me the fonts were too small. I hope you can see this now. I hope you can see it. You can also look, if you hate the rank definition, you can look at the level slope where you're using years of education on years of education. So this is just for comparison with other researchers. A couple of things that you see, the survey data give you slightly different answers, but in fact, estimates of changes over time are very similar. This is really nice. And we can't reject that these are the same. You also have, so you have slightly larger effects for the level slope, but that's a regression coefficient comparison, and so the variance there is going to enter in. If you look at the expected rank in the later 20th century, this is using the expected rank in linked data. It's slightly larger in survey data, so if anything, we think it's going to be a little bit conservative in ours. And then if you have a different measure you like, for example, the bottom 40th to the top 60th, that is a transition from the bottom 40 to the top 60, which is not something we can exactly measure in 2 periods, but it's as close as we can get. If we just want to look at a binary measure, we're also finding similar types of estimates, though in magnitude different, as you would expect. So those are so what I wanted to show you here is essentially it looks like persistence has fallen over the 20th century. That is, relative mobility has increased. And absolute upward mobility has increased over time. So those are the big picture results. So the next part, we want to start kind of breaking this down to talk about subgroups.
May I ask you one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Do you have anything about siblings? So I always remember this
Ah.
Anoushka graph, the firstborn
Yes.
has the highest test score, second and third born worse, and fourth born is again better.
Mm-hmm.
So the first and the last get more attention,
Yeah.
the middle ones get squeezed out. So within family, there must by definition be variation across siblings.
Yes.
I'm wondering whether the upper point and the lower point matters, and whether the move to smaller families also means that the average kid now has a different expectancy.
Yes, absolutely. We do not have this in this talk, but I just told you all the data we spent years putting together. So you got a preview of where we're going. Yes. So I don't have that for you here, but that's exactly. So once we have these results, the idea is to start boring down. And I think part of, you didn't say this, but so don't let me put words in your mouth that this is not what you mean. But if you think if families have shrunk, that may mean that there's a more direct way for parents to transmit their human capital to fewer children. Whereas if you have more children, it's more complicated because you have less time to interact with them or something like that. So that would be a case where we would expect persistence to increase. That's been one trend over the 20th century. Offsetting that is the increased educational expenditure, which we think may break the link between your parents' own education and your own ability to attain more. And on average, it looks like, well, here, the persistence has fallen, suggesting that something potentially not your own parents' human capital, if you believe that the natural outcome would be of smaller families, that parents are more likely to pass on their own human capital, we see that doesn't seem to be dominating at least the national trend. But we can look at this by birth order and other fun things later on. Okay, so I showed you, I benchmarked these. These are our 2 data points. We add the survey estimates. You can see that we're linking quite tightly. I cannot do this for a lot of other subgroups. We just don't have enough of them. So I just want to show you. So we think we're doing pretty well, at least in the historical period when we're using linked data. But we can't show you that our estimates are representative of particular counties because we simply do not have estimates for counties to compare to. But let me start by just breaking this down for some different groups over time. So first, this rank slope. How has this changed over the 20th century? This panel here is for men. This panel here is for women. So you can see for men, there's been a shift down for almost all of these groups. These are white American men, Black men, Asian American men, and Native American men. And you can see the confidence intervals are quite large here, much smaller in the current period. But you can see over time, all of these have gone down. So that persistence is falling across a broad number of groups. And you can also see that it seems to be falling a lot more for some groups. But this is even more evident if we look at the upward mobility, which we are going to measure throughout this talk, is the expected educational rank of children who have parents at the 25th percentile. And I want to point out a couple of things here. So one thing that's really important is we've seen a broad increase in that upward mobility, say for Black men from the 18th percent. So if their parents were at the 25th percentile, they're ending up at the 18th percentile on average. That is, they are downwardly mobile on average. That's increasing to the 28th percentile. So they're roughly holding constant or maybe increasing their upward mobility, though not by a lot over this period. You can also look at, say, Asian American men, and you see there's an increase from roughly the 38th percentile if you had a parent at the 25th percentile to the 50th percentile, and you also see the same gains for women. For women, you also see slight increases for white women and large increases for Black women, from roughly no upward or downward mobility to considerable upward mobility, at least relative to the early 20th century. But there's a few other things I want to point out. The first is that the gender gap has really grown. So if you look at men overall, we have 34 percentile ranks falling to roughly 33 percentile ranks for men who are born to parents at the 25th percentile. But you can also see that this varies a great deal across subgroups. For women, you see that there's been an increase of roughly 5 percentile points. So this means that there's a gender gap. There was a slight gender gap in the early 20th century, but it's really grown to roughly 9 percentile points for cohorts at the end of the 20th century. You've also seen that there's a large narrowing of the Black-white gap. This is true for both men, in part because white men's upward mobility has fallen and Black men's upward mobility has increased. You also see very little change, or much less, smaller of a change for white women here. I put the arrows in so you didn't have to eyeball it. And much larger gains for Black women. Asian American, both men and women, are today the most upwardly mobile in the United States, and you can also see that Native American men and women are among the least mobile, educationally mobile, I should say. And overall, these broad gains, they're generally increases in upward mobility, decreases in persistence across groups, have been offset by these changes for white men. These are big, right? And Native American men. Native American men, you see that there's also a decline, but they're a much smaller share of the population. For white men, this is big. And for those of you interested in political economy, if you've been paying attention to anything about sort of what's going on right now in American politics, I can't help but think that this has really interesting implications for voting patterns and a variety of other things like the manosphere that have been getting a lot of traction. Okay, so the second thing I want to talk about is the changing landscape of educational mobility. I previewed a couple of maps for you. So when we break this down by county, this is what it looks like in the early 20th century. And for those of you who have seen maps by Huy Ren Tan or by Raj Chetty, this won't surprise you at all. Upward educational mobility in the South is much, much lower than it is other places in the United States at this time. There's, interestingly, a lot of upward mobility in the West, and you also see some here. This is like Michigan, Ann Arbor. This is where I used to live, right over here. And then you can see sort of up here, this is around sort of northern Ohio and so on. So you see a lot of upward mobility in this area that's going to become the Rust Belt later on in the 20th century. So there's a lot of upward mobility there. And you can also see a little bit over here in like Rhode Island. So now what might surprise you is if you look later in the 20th century, and we have, by the way, one of the difficulties when you look at these maps, and this is something that I only discovered because I was confused looking at a variety across papers, is that you have to make sure that the bins are defined the same way if you want to look at changes over time. So a lot of times if you're comparing a map from the historical literature and a map in the modern literature, they're using different levels, which implies different colors and might lead you to believe something else. But one of the things you see, if you look at how the South changed over the 20th century in terms of upward educational mobility, there's been a dramatic convergence. So it's sitting here right about the mean in the later 20th century. You've also seen declining upward educational mobility in the West, in a lot of the Rust Belt. Here you see some pockets here of green in New Jersey and also sort of in the plains. So one of the things you'll see is, so there's been a huge convergence in educational mobility across the 20th century. So if you just look at the correlation across place, and again, these are not two separate measures. We're not looking at education versus income or education versus occupation. We're looking for the same measure of education in the two periods. The correlation is actually quite low, 0.23. So there's been big changes over the 20th century in what's gone on. So I just summarized this. Another way to see this is I'm plotting here the 45-degree line. And if you look at the upward mobility for the 1910 to the early 20th century cohorts and compare it against the later 20th century cohorts, that is, for someone who is at the 40th percentile, if you fall here, that would mean it hasn't changed in your location over the 20th century. For those above, you've increased, and those below, you've decreased upward mobility over this time. So you can see a whole lot here. This is the South, a lot of catch up, big increases in upward mobility, and you can also see some of that downward mobility over here. The other thing you can see is the massive shift in the variance, right? It's really, really spread out here, and it's much less spread out here. And what that means, again, that's speaking to this massive convergence. So one of the things that comes out of this is where you grow up, where you are educated, matters a lot less in the modern United States than it did in the early 20th century. That is, local public finance and local schools now are doing much better if you think that's what's going on today than they were historically. Historically, place mattered a great deal. Okay. The other thing is, how am I doing on time? I've got 20 minutes left. Or do you need me to stop early because of
20 minutes, 20, yeah.
20 is okay.
Minutes actually.
And then,
22.
okay, Good. So the other thing you can see is if you just want to look at the top 10 counties for upward educational mobility, which one were the top ones for the early 20th century and which ones were the top one in the later 20th century. You see a couple appear in both. San Francisco is there, but Los Angeles disappears, and you can look at some of the other ones. You see a lot of, I told you, New Jersey, New York. Those are really upwardly mobile places today in terms of education. Those all make the top 10. They weren't there, most of them, in the early 20th century. You can also compare it to Raj Chetty's top 10 in terms of income mobility here, and also Huiren Tan's upward mobility for white men. And now remember, when you're looking at income mobility, this is also a different sample. Raj Chetty does have women in there if they're earning income for the later 20th century. But if you're looking at Huiren Tan's map, we're looking at men, because that's who one can link. They're white men also. And so you're comparing here. So there's slightly different definitions, but you can see that these are not necessarily the same place. There's some of the same places, like the Bronx is in there, you see San Francisco's in there, Los Angeles is in there, Alameda's in there, but there are a variety of other places in terms of income mobility. So one of the things I want to say, like these are not exactly, we're correlating with other people's measures here, is that upward educational mobility in an accounting sense, not in a causal sense, but in an accounting sense, explains a lot of upward income mobility in the early 20th century and the later 20th century, but definitely not all of it. There's a lot of other things going on as well. So that's just something to keep in mind. And if you look at changes in upward educational mobility here on this axis, and then changes in upward educational mobility here, you can also see that there's a powerful correlation, though the R squared is only 0.2. Okay. Let me move on next. So what explains these big correlations? And I told you, I think I revealed my prior, I'm like, how much can increases in investments in public schools, how far can they go in helping us explain sort of this big convergence that we've seen over time in the United States? So this is really hard to test, and I don't mean to stand here and tell you that I have it completely nailed causally. If only we had really good quasi-experiments in this. So we're going to try to do our best to get at the causal relationship using a state border design. One of the things that's really hard here, there's a couple of things. So how do we think about changes in these measures? We're going to use a couple of measures. We're going to use the number of teachers per child. That's a standard measure of educational quality, people will call it in the modern literature. Salaries for teacher, that's also a measure of educational quality. I will also just say, as an economic historian, I think those capture both access and quality. These things are correlated, so it's not only quality in the historical period. The other piece we want to look at is changes in the number of instructors at public universities over time. This is not something that's been as commonly used, but one of the things we were interested in is not just instructors at private universities or private school access, but how much is the public sector investing in its education, and can we look to see if that's having an effect on this upward mobility in particular.
Can I just ask a
Yeah, sure.
clarification?
Go for
When you use teachers per child, do you use per child in the population rather than child enrolled, which would be endogenous?
We use per child in the population, primarily because we measure that well. So, but we think most children are enrolled in this period. We're also going to look at changes in publication. So the other thing is how do you think about changes in spending? Do you want to think about changes in dollars? Do you want to just think about changes in the number of teachers? What is the right number of changes in teachers over time? There's been huge changes in sort of norms about class size, women's wages, which should drive up the cost of education everywhere, investments in public universities, the cost of space, resources for schools. So for a variety of reasons, you might not want to use the level of changes. So what we're going to do is look at a relative measure of changes. That is, and that sort of implicitly assumes that there's some sort of increase over time in the amount of expenditures that everyone has to do to kind of to not have any effect on upward intergenerational mobility. Because women now earn a lot more than they did at the early 20th century, those costs are going to rise of just hiring teachers, for example. So we're going to look at the comparison we're going to be making. So we're going to compare changes in public education, and we're going to standardize them relative to a mean. This is a national mean. So in places that went up by more than the national mean in terms of the number of instructors, the wages of teachers, or the number of public tertiary education instructors. That the idea is that we're going to be looking to see if you had a larger increase than the national average, do we see an increase in your upward intergenerational mobility, in contrast to smaller increase, a decline. Yes, go ahead.
So how, I'm gonna get my head around it. So how do you think about migration, internal migration in the US shaping these patterns? So it seems to be that you're saying there's something to do with geography, but could also just people moving around,
That's right.
moving
So
towards
mhm.
opportunity or whatever.
That's right. And so one of the reasons, this is kind of in the background, but thank you for bringing this up. I should have said more about it. One of the difficulties in this literature has been looking to see where people are living versus where they were educated. And one of the nice things about the data, the way we've constructed, is we have a really good measure of either where you were born from the Numident file or where you were living in childhood, regardless of where you end up as an adult. So if I observe you in the 2000 census, living with your parents, you were in primary or secondary school, I'm going to use that as a proxy for the local public school policies or these measures, right? Not where you end up when I see you in the ACS later, right? If you move to a bigger city or something like that, that's a real problem. So we're doing that, that's in the background here, and I should have mentioned those estimates are for the place where children are living in childhood, not where they end up.
Okay.
And that's especially important for things like the Great Migration that are mixing things up, et cetera. Yeah, go ahead.
Is it possible to understand how much of the effect might be explained by compulsory schooling laws?
They're actually strongly related to these measures. But because they don't vary a lot at the local level, we're not using them in this analysis, but we could. That's actually a direction we're going. So it turns out that if you have a compulsory schooling law, you have more instructors per student, right? So yeah, so these are all kind of bundles.
To get resources to
Right.
implement it, right? But also,
Right.
I think it might affect primarily people on the 25th rank then.
You mean they're staying in school? So there's compulsory entry laws and then
So
minimum
the
leaving
new law
age.
didn't affect me, but it's gonna affect my kid. And so he's automatically, he will get a higher level of education. than me.
That's
Just by
right,
fact.
that's right. So we haven't,
Regardless of other investments the state might.
the way to think about what we're doing, and let me show you, these are our three measures that we are using, is that we're thinking about these as just proxies of investment. So I'll make a lot of statements saying, we do not, so this is, I think, the tip of the iceberg kind of thing. We choose them because they've been used in the literature and they vary at the local level. So there's a variety of other things, though, you might think are correlated with them. Compulsory schooling laws, there's all sorts of local labor markets, the demand for workers, and so on. So these are just the correlations. So this is a 1 standard deviation increase, larger increase in K through 12 teachers per child, ages 15 to 18 in the population. Average teacher salary, and then this is public college instructors per child, also for the same denominator, just so that you can compare. And this is the expected rank at the 25th percentile, our measure of upward educational mobility. And so you can see in every case, there's a strong positive association, but there's a lot of reasons to worry. Of course, this is not causal, right? Omitted variables bias is a really, really big concern here. There's changes in resources locally that are going to reflect, so local costs of education. For example, if women are entering labor markets a lot, it's a lot more expensive to hire them to be teachers, for example, or changes in the demand for educated workers. If you want them in local labor markets, there's all sorts of reasons why there might be different outcomes that have nothing to do with educational access or quality and everything to do with the demand for workers. So we can't address that directly, but we're going to try to do our best to kind of get at some of those things. So first, I want to point out that state factors are going to matter a lot here. In fact, if you just regress sort of differences in upward educational mobility on across county on state fixed effects, for the early 20th century cohorts, you're going to explain about 61% of the cross-sectional variation with those state fixed effects. So state factors are important. We don't know what's in there, but they're definitely important. Compulsory schooling laws could be part of that. And then roughly a third for those later 20th century cohorts, which, by the way, is going to reflect that convergence we see. The other thing we think is that state funds for public education or public colleges go to a lot of children from lower income backgrounds. They are not going to very expensive private schools. They're going to be much more likely to enter into public universities where they're going to get their attention. So we think that these state factors matter, and state funds affect the availability of state level colleges and institutions. I've worked it too, so they matter a lot. The other thing, whoops, a little delayed. What about the validity of this design? Okay, so when we use a state border design, the what we want to be true is that county labor markets, the local costs of hiring teachers, culture, values, all of these other types of things that are going on are going to be similar for counties on two different sides of the state border. So we're going to identify these county pairs. That is, they're very, very similar, but the big difference between those two counties are going to be these state level factors that are influencing teacher pay, the supply of teachers or the hiring of teachers, and the availability of universities. And by the way, it's just going to a university on the other side of state line has like massive implications for tuition, if you think about it. So that's going to be important. So we think that your local, your where you live is actually going to determine where you can go to college. So those state factors will matter there. But the other thing we want is that changes in those unobservable determinants of upward mobility, whatever they are, within county pairs, are not going to be correlated with changes in public resources for education. So there may be things, a lot of things we don't observe, but I hope I can put your mind at ease by showing you the things we do and showing how well the design works for those. The other part that's harder here, excludability. The only reason why state is going to matter across the border is local or state educational policy. This is very, very hard to verify, and it's hard to test. So we went back through and we looked at a number of other factors that are changing at the state level. Women's suffrage, you can think about a number of public works, public investments in all sorts of public health campaigns, things like that. Now, those regressions are not high-powered because remember, we only have 50 states. So you're doing what you can to try to rule that out. But so I want you to keep that in mind. There's not that much I can do about that. But the one where you do see a big relationship is compulsory schooling laws. And those are important, but we think that that's actually part of the package that we wish to measure. Okay, so what we'll be looking at is upward educational mobility within a county pair and looking at its relationship with changes in state resources over the 20th century in counties on both sides of that pair. So just to kind of visualize this for one of our measures, and I put these in levels, you can see this is for average, like the average teacher salaries. So for example, in Arkansas here, they have very, very low salaries, but just across the border, they have much higher salaries, right? They do not in Mississippi, but they do in Missouri, not slightly higher in Louisiana, and so on. So those are the types of comparisons we will be making, and we cluster our standard errors at the county border level. And you can also see those over time. So I haven't shown you the changes here. I'm just showing you the levels just so you can kind of get a sense of what the raw data look like. We have these same things for all of the. Another thing you can see here is that there are very large counties in places where no one lives, right out in the middle of the desert in Nevada. So we do a number of robustness checks I'm not going to show you where you start dropping, you know, is this really a good comparison for this on this side? You know, how important is that? So you can see here the nice places where a lot more people live. There's a whole lot of counties on both sides of the pair. So the hope is that assumption about local labor markets and other types of local factors being the same holds. Okay, now, yeah, go ahead.
Does any one county belong to multiple pairs?
Yes, it can. This is again a little in the weeds, but yes, it can. So you can use. There's a variety of ways to do this, but yes, we are using some counties belong to different pairs. Okay, so coming back here, if you want to just look at raw correlations in the characteristics of local places and the changes in those characteristics across the 20th century, what we've done is we've come up with a bunch of measures that one, we can compare over time, and two, and this is where the font might be really small for those of you in the back, that we can change over time, and also some that link very closely to Raj Chetty's measures of sort of the local determinants of income mobility for the later 20th century. And let me just kind of read these off. We've standardized them all so that you can compare the coefficients. This is population density, share Black, share Hispanic, share Asian, share foreign-born, share born out of state, income inequality in terms of the Gini, racial, residential segregation in terms of the Tile Index, share urban households, share farm households, labor force participation rate, manufacturing employment share, business and professional services employment share, income per capita, median house value, public administration workers per capita, productive workers per capita, healthcare workers per capita. I feel like an auctioneer. Share adults married, share divorced, share children in a single parent household, average household size, and share religious adherence that we're getting from separate census data. So the goal there was to try to come up with a whole bunch of stuff. So we can't see all sorts of things about these places, but we do have pretty good measures of a number of things in the census and in some of the, like the shared religious adherence from a census of religious bodies for this period. And without the pair fixed effects, that's these orange dots, one of the things you'll notice is that there are a number of these changes in these characteristics are also correlated with changes in K through 12 or the average salary. So they are correlated with our measures. But as soon as you add the state pair fixed effects, you see they're much more comparable. So these orange dots are comparing across all of those counties. The green dots are just comparing along the border. And you can see that they align much more closely. So we can't put your mind at ease about all the things we don't observe. Our best evidence is for the things we do observe. There's a lot of balance. Okay. So let me show you what the results are. So the dependent variable here is going to be changes in upward mobility measured in percentile ranks. And these are our three measures that I was just showing you here that have been standardized so that you can compare these coefficients. So the first column here is without any controls. This is every 2,800 counties that we can observe over time. There's also some other things we did to clean out counties that we can't compare over time, but again, that's a technical footnote. So I just want to show you these raw correlations here. And as I showed you before, even when you're controlling for the other ones, those others were just single correlations. You can see that the partial correlations still hold and are highly statistical significant. Now, if you just limit it to the border counties, so one concern you have as you move to a border design, like who lives on the border anyway? Like what are these weird border places? In fact, you see that those coefficients I wanted to show you, they're not wildly different. This is not using the border design yet, but that those coefficients are very similar. So the border places don't look particularly strange, right? They're a little bit different, but not super strange. Now, if you use the border design here, these county pair fixed effects, you see that it almost kills this coefficient in here, dropping it from like 4.5, 4.3 percentile ranks down to 1 percentile rank. But that's still a substantial effect. It's an economically meaningful effect. And you see exactly the same thing for the public college instructors for ages 18. And then you can also do a lot of other things to disclose things from the Census Bureau. We had to add noise to our county level estimates. So we use Bayesian shrinkage to kind of try to adjust for that. And when you do that, it's sort of, you can see that the estimates here are similar, but slightly stronger. Okay, so let me tell you how to interpret these. So these three measures together, if you look at, I don't know which your preferred is. Some people like the Bayesian shrunk, some people don't like it at all because we're shrinking towards the state mean. These three measures are going to explain roughly 10% of the change in upward educational mobility in those border counties over the 20th century. Is 10% large? Is it small? I think it's pretty large. The reason is because we only are using three characteristics that we think are badly measuring investments in public education. There are things that we can get over time. There are things that are comparable. There are things that are well measured and they're reported at the local level. So if you measured everything you wanted to measure about education, I'm guessing that number would be a lot higher. We don't have it, so I'm thinking of this as kind of the tip of the iceberg type of measures. That's what we're getting here. So I think this is large. Again, microeconomists generally feel we're doing pretty well. We're getting up in the double digits. So I feel like macroeconomists don't. So we felt like those are pretty big results. The other thing you can do is you can decompose things a bit. So we can use just a very simple Kitagawa, Blinder, Oaxaca decomposition with different reference groups. You can do this for the entire US, and you can just look at this without using the state border estimates. But you can also substitute the state border estimates in for this other counties. You can also use the means in the South or the means in the non-South as your reference group, depending. But what I want you to take away from here is if you use the state border design estimates and you apply them to the entire sample, not just the border county sample, we are going to explain roughly 20% of the convergence between the South and the non-South over the 20th century. So again, I think they seem kind of small, but if you think of this as a tip of the iceberg type of estimate, I think they're quite large. So let me conclude. I'm doing okay? Okay, great. So I've showed you that relative and upward educational mobility have increased over the 20th century. Overall, that increase has been very modest. But if you look kind of under the hood at different subgroups or across space, some of the convergence has been very, very dramatic. We've seen small national changes that mask very large regional convergence, and also different trends, especially for white men and white women and other types of groups. And finally, I've shown you the geographic convergence across the 20th century. I think I just said this, so I don't need to repeat myself. Explain a lot of the share of upward mobility, and we think that this is probably a lower bound on what we might actually explain, as long as you believe the estimates are causal. And I've done my best to convince you that they are, but again, this is hard. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to your comments.
I'm going to invite James to take the Q&A.
I'm supposed to moderate questions for you.
Oh,
I trust
wonderful.
you to take your own questions.
Oh, okay.
But I'll make sure everybody shuts up by 1:45.
Okay. Andrew.
Thank you for a fascinating talk, and it's a really remarkable study. Congratulations. Now, the thing about measuring rank, I think perhaps Sonia was implying this, is there's only so much ordinal rank to go around in a society. So some people are coming up, others are going down. You're taking a particular moral view, I think, and I think that might be okay. You might explain your moral view, or what I take to be an ethical view, if you like. But thinking of policy, I was trying to understand the units in your fascinating later regressions. Would I be right in thinking that if I've got $40,000 to spend on educational resources, I should put it into teachers' salaries and not hire an extra teacher?
Well, that's what the results say. Yes, that's right.
Yes, that's what I thought. So we were looking at something like 1.97. See, I could read your font
Yeah,
size.
good.
And it was smaller on the teachers.
Okay. Let me come back. Well,
It was fairly near the end.
okay.
Is it twice as useful? If this is your criterion for welfare, and some people might disagree with it,
Well, let me
was
come.
it twice as useful to put the 40,000 into near the end?
Let me. I'm
You know,
throwing the
so
wrong way
you
my
had
slides.
nearly all your controls in.
Mhm.
And you
Let me say two things here. So one is we focused on this number here, which is upward mobility at the 25th percentile. If you think that you want to look at upward mobility, you could just as easily look at downward mobility at the 75th percentile, for example. But the key is, because both of these are normed to fit through the 50th percentile, they're mechanically related in the rank framework. So because we've normed by that, it's just going to happen. So we've chosen to focus on just one point to kind of capture that, but one doesn't have to. And the advantage, because we have a lot of disclosure limitations coming out of the census, we cannot disclose all sorts of estimates for different count, so we had to make some choices, and so we did. So that's one. But let me come over to the next part. How do we understand this, right? And one of the things that this says is that in standard deviation terms, this has a larger effect on the percentile rank. Oh, this is twice as important, right? But I haven't broken it out in terms of the decomposition. Let me see if I got this here.
That's fine, and other people want to ask questions, and of course we might worry about whether these are truly causal, but it seemed like an important point to get clear in our mind for policy.
It does seem, so this is, I'll let you stare at this while other people, this is the explained component of changes in the South, non-South, but I don't have this for the regression overall, predicting how much of these explain these differences, and it looks like for that convergence, the K through 12 teachers and public college instructors seem to be much more important than salaries. So, but I don't have the other decomposition. So. Thank you for your question. Yes, Sasha.
Still a bit on the same issue. So in the rank, upward mobility and downward mobility go both ways. But in absolute terms, it is theoretically possible that we all end up doing a PhD in the next generation, right?
Yeah.
In theory. And that would be the ultimate upward mobility. Everyone gets the highest degree possible.
Right.
And I'm trying to square these two things together. So if we have two university professors their kids cannot get any higher in education degree
Right.
levels. So there must be downward mobility on average.
There is.
Yeah, and I'm trying to square these things. So your pitch sounds very much American. There is this upward
Strong
mobility.
upward mobility.
Yeah, it's the American dream.
And there's downward
right?
mobility too.
Yeah.
Yes, not the American dream.
But is there an asymmetry of sorts that some places, however well you start, bring you down? Because in some sense you are saying here is some places where if you happen to be born there, you would have had amazing chances to move up. But are there other places that destroy your opportunities?
If we look at, let me look at the map. Let's see here. These are related to this, but I think the map can make that very. I think this is dying, but we made it through the talk here, right? So this average, so this yellow number here, so you can just think about the levels. The yellow is basically 28 plus to roughly 37, right, in this range. So that is for a parent at the 25th percentile. Those children are expected in all the yellow percentiles to end up slightly above. So this is a little upward mobility. But these red and orange places, and you see those pockets around, you see them, some places here, just little places. Those are places where you're not expected to, if you're born to a parent with a 25th percentile, to actually achieve that yourself. So you can see there's a little bit of that, but it's mostly, as you can see from the map, upward mobility.
Yeah.
Yes.
I wanted to ask if you have, there may be no information, but if you have any sense of how America's progress in this time span compares with Europe or any other country?
There's some nice papers actually doing comparative studies. This one, the Hertz et al. Study, that is a fantastic study. It appears in the BE journals, and they have, what the goal is there, they do present estimates for America, the United States here, but they also present estimates for every other single country they could get. That includes Europe, South America, Asia. So anything they can get is all in that article. So I can give you that reference, but you can look at this one over time. Not all of them span the same periods just because you're working with what you can get. But yes, you can compare it. One of the things that's tricky though, is you can see these estimates increase, and we were trying to figure out why that is. Because our estimates for US surveys go down, and they're using the survey that they think is internationally comparable. And we think part of the issue is that when you start to get, it has to do with the age of the kids and the parents, and the way that is kind of in the sample, which can affect things. So some of the cohorts they've got here are really quite young. So they're measuring more persistence. That is, they haven't completed yet. And that's, so I think that's part of the concern with that study, so something to keep in mind. But I think that if you want to look at those comparisons, they're there in that paper. They did a really nice job. Yes.
So just in terms of interpreting, so at low levels of education, I can see that the more you get educated, the more it is an investment in human capital and might be a good thing. But as you get more and more educated, you're trading off entry into the labor market with education. So it's not obvious that lots of people in the 25th percentile doing a PhD is a good thing if that is simply reflecting the fact that they can't get any other jobs.
That's not here. The other thing I'll say, so yes, I think that's important. That's all rolled into the background. We're just thinking about if you get more education, that means you had more opportunities. So the other piece that's not here is educational quality. So if going to school in some of those places isn't nearly the same type of education as it is in other places, we're not measuring that. It's really hard to measure that, unless you think that something about teacher salary is gosh, we're almost dead here. I'll use my cursor here. Unless you think that teacher salary is kind of picking that up, but so we don't have a lot of measures of educational quality here. We could try to add more of them, but those are largely missing. And if you think that that's related to your ability to not just getting a high school degree, but learning a lot in school, that's really hard to measure from what we're doing. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, but not something I can answer today. Yes.
At the beginning, you mentioned that it's more about the percepted earnings to education and not actually the realized earnings to education, right? When it comes to make the investment in terms of how much school am I going to do or not. Do you have any information on how that perception may change across the US?
Perception of
I mean, the expectation. I mean,
potential earnings.
yes.
Um,
Or people's.
Well, it can vary a great deal across the U.S. That's one of the reasons why we think income mobility is not perfectly correlated with educational mobility, is that so even if you get a lot of education, your ability to enter the local labor market, earn a good salary may be very limited by where you live. So that's one of the reasons those two measures aren't perfectly correlated. But if you think that getting a better education, having more education allows you to move, then you think it still matters for your mobility. Where you choose to locate, the job you choose, right, is a very different thing than the potential job you could have and where you could potentially move. And that you can think of educational mobility as measuring that.
How many counties or what share of counties can you go all the way up to 4-year college? Are there counties where you are
yeah,
forced to move?
of course.
Yeah.
Of course, there are a lot of them. I don't think there are 4-year colleges in every county, but I don't know what share.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry if I missed it, but if I'm thinking about the Great Migration, so you have like an education distribution before the Great Migration, and you probably have like Black Americans in the bottom of the distribution. Then many of them leave towards industrial cities, so the distribution shifts.
Right.
And white Americans who were like around the middle of something like that are shifted towards the bottom of the new distribution in those same countries, right? Like the parents. Like, I'm thinking about the sort of, I know this is confusing. I'm also a bit confused, but if I'm thinking about the 1982, 1997 cohorts, the distribution that you observe for the parents, is it measured before or after the distribution has shifted because of the out-migration that has happened?
The parents' migration or the parents' education we're measuring either in the 1940 census, in the 2000 census, or in the ACS, depending. I'm trying to remember offhand. I think we limited it to parents of a certain age, so that we're trying to kind of keep that measure very consistent across time. But I now I need to look back at my own paper. I don't remember offhand. So yes, we're measuring the parents where they live, wherever they are, but we're not interested in studying what determines their education. We're interested in understanding what determines how their education affects their children's education, which we think is determined by local circumstances where they're living when their children are growing up and potentially getting educated. So that's what we can measure. Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, similar to Sasha, I'm also I'm not interested. I'm generally interested, but I'm particularly interested not in the American nightmare, not in the American dream, but in the nightmare. And you hinted that you will, or you may have already looked at the nightmare effects on voting patterns.
I haven't looked at this.
Taking your map here and projecting it on Republican voting share, does that fit your expectation?
I have not done that exercise, but one of the things I think that's less evident here that you might think, so if you were looking at sort of red-blue areas, one of the things you would be able to find on the map are a lot of cities in blue and a lot of rural areas in red. And if you look here, you might see a handful of cities, right? But you have to kind of search for them, right? It seems a lot more leveled out than one might expect given the political map. So there may be a relationship there, but it's not something that's popping out of the map. So I've never worked on sort of voting in these types of things. Well, I guess in one paper. But for those of you who are interested, we do have these disclosed, and I'm happy to make these estimates available to you if you're interested. We're planning on publishing these when we publish the paper.
Would you be able to break down the results by rural versus urban?
Sure, I mean, you'll have it by county.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you could break it down based on those county shares. One of the things that we do not have from the Census Bureau yet, and it's not entirely clear if we'll be able to get from the Census Bureau, these estimates are for everyone. But when we start wanting to break it down, so what about Black and white Americans? What about women and men by county? Those I'm not sure they're going to be able to give those to us based on sample size restrictions. So that's harder, but we'd like to know that. We'll see what we can do. It's the end of everyone's day.
Well, then thank you very
We've
much.
worked hard. Yes, thank you.